Hi there, everyone. Welcome back to Chasing Thoughts with Chase. And today I'm going to be finishing up my review of the Lord of the Rings trilogy. And by the way, this is not a summary. This is more of pointing out cool little details. So if you have not watched Lord of the Rings Return of the King, then you're not going to have any idea what the heck I'm talking about. So if you haven't watched that yet, then go and watch that and then watch this video, because believe me, everything will make 10 times. So anyway, I always start my notes with how long the movie is. This movie is nearly 4.5 hours long. And yes, for context of those of you who this might be your first episode, I have watched the extended editions of all three for these podcast episodes, which means they're super long. I put in my notes that I was going to be cringing in physical pain by the time this movie is finally over, because at that point, I had already watched like 8 hours worth of movies, and I was not eager for 4 over the course of 2 weeks, and I was not eager for 4 more. But also, another fun fact before I actually go into the true analysis of this is that this is the only extended movie that I actually own out of the 3. The other 2 I watched on my aunt and uncle's Vudu, because, long story, we share the same Vudu account with our aunt and uncle. And that's how I was able to make this plus another podcast episode I have in store. But also, I could have also just watched the third one on their Vudu. The issue is, on the only TV that can watch it, Vudu, is in the living room, and that's usually being watched by my younger brother. So essentially, long story short, I got really tired of having to wait for a proper opening. So I'm just like, screw this, I'm gonna watch it on my own time. So I ended up doing it in one session right after buying the movie for myself on YouTube. And I ended up staying till like after midnight, watching the movie and taking notes on it. Because another thing is, I like pause every 5 to 10 minutes to take notes. And even with this, my notes make barely any sense. Anyway, the movie starts with some Smeagol lore. Ooh, interesting. Basically, it tells us how Gollum got the ring. We learned that his friend Deagle, yes, that is his friend's name, stumbles upon the ring while the two of them are fit. And Smeagol basically they're both drawn to the ring because of its abilities, and Smeagol ends up killing his friend Deagle for the ring. We also learned that he's also a hobbit before he became whatever he is, and that he was kicked out of the Shire as a result of murdering Deagle. And then I also put next to my notes, Treebeard refers to Gandalf as young, which I noted was interesting because Treebeard is supposedly significant, because it means that Treebeard is older than Gandalf, and Gandalf is like 3,000 years old. But also, I literally put this in the last podcast episode, so I'm sorry if it sounds like I'm repeating myself. I think I did. Did I? I gotta check my notes. I think I did. I think I mentioned it in the last podcast episode, but it's not in my notes. So basically, all you need to know, last movie, basically, Treebeard, Merry, and Pippin, and the other Ents took down the fortifications in Isengard, and the only thing that's remaining is Saruman cowering in his tower. So Gandalf finally arrives to talk to Saruman. Saruman, during this exchange with Gandalf, calls him out for basically saying how Gandalf is willing to sacrifice those he cares about for the greater good. And he decides to cast a spell at Gandalf, and my man Gandalf, he just simply says, "Your staff is broken," and it just literally explodes in his hand. And I just would like to say, Gandalf is a lot more powerful than people may think. But again, that's obviously getting into Silmarillion territory, so I'm not going to mention it more. And also, if you're wondering, I'm going to make a short about the Silmarillion and a little bit more about what that exactly is. So don't worry, I will be making some content on the channel giving some form of context of this before I release the compilation. Do not worry. So anyway, Grima, who was originally the king's nasty royal advisor from the second movie, who was working for Saruman and got kicked out once Saruman was dispelled from Theoden, who was the king of Rohan. I did not remember his name at all last episode, but now but now I do, and I feel really embarrassed that I just didn't mention it at all because I legitimately could not remember his name. And anyway, he just essentially assaults Grima, and Grima ends up stabbing Saruman in the back. Now, there's actually a little bit of off-film lore I would like to discuss because I'm not sure if Christopher Lee himself said this, but I think it might have been someone who was working with Christopher Lee during the production of the Lord of the Rings movies. And also, just as a bit of context, Christopher Lee is the actor for Saruman. He also plays Count Dooku in the Star Wars movies. Amazing actor, by the way. He basically recalls that Peter Jackson, the guy who made the Lord of the Rings movies, basically came up to him and said, hey, I'm gonna write this scene about you getting stabbed in the back. Here's how I want you to act it out. And Christopher Lee is like, because he wanted him to be all dramatic with like the screaming and stuff, but he's like, no, that's not how it works. When you get stabbed in the back, you go like, and kind of like almost gasp for air because the air out of your lungs is literally just being stabbed out of you. Peter Jackson, along with his fellow colleagues, decided not to press further about the knowledge of this, and I'm not exactly sure if this is gospel. You guys can correct me if I am wrong, but I do believe that Christopher Lee has a past in MI6, which is the British version of the CIA, essentially, but I do believe he used to work. And also, another interesting Christopher Lee fact is that he actually knew J.R.R. Tolkien, who was the author of the Lord of the Rings series. Again, very, very interesting off-film stuff. Anyway, getting back to the plot of the film, Saruman specifically dies in one of the most undignified ways possible. And I'm not going to explain this. I'm just going to say, if you've watched the movies, you know what I am talking about, and you know how undignified it is. Like, I get that he's not a likable character and he betrayed his entire order and purpose, but even I think that was a little excessive for the dude. Just ouch. So basically there's a celebration. Then we switch scenes back over to the Kingdom of Rohan, who is celebrating the fact that they managed to push back the Uruk-hai. There's a drinking contest between Gimli and Legolas, and Gimli loses this, which kind of surprised me. I should also say that pretty much every time I wrote down a new paragraph worth of notes, there is some kind of scene change that I did not cover for whatever reason, because I am very interested. Also, I just need to get this as context before, because otherwise, a couple paragraphs down, this is not going to make any sense. But after Saruman dies, Gandalf gains possession of the Palantir he was using to communicate with Sauron. And trust me, this specific Palantir does serve an important role later in the movie. So you do need to... So, anyway, it switches back to Gollum, Frodo, and Sam, who are around near the edge of Mordor. And Gollum is essentially conversing with Smeagol, repeating their plot to betray Frodo and Sam. And Smeagol's a little hesitant about it because he doesn't want to hurt Frodo, because Frodo's actually being nice to him. And then Gollum gets attacked by Sam for the third time in the last two movies. I did not mention the other two times, but just know in between this, between this moment and the start of the last movie, Gollum has been attacked by Sam at least twice, because Sam absolutely does not trust Gollum at all, which, by the way, good judgment on him. There's another scene change. Again, I did not cover this. There must have been like 10, maybe 15 minutes between this one and the next one. So basically, it was about how Eowyn comes into Aragorn's sleep, communicates to Aragorn in his sleep, because I guess that's something elves can do, telling him of a dream she had, relating to her feeling powerless to stop the consuming darkness. Aragorn comforts her and tells her to go back to sleep. That's basically what I put. And now this is where the Palantir becomes important, because Gandalf is currently with Merry and Pip, and Pippin specifically is a little bit curious about the Palantir. While Gandalf stored it in his beard to obviously keep it safe, but while he's sleeping, Pippin decides to go and touch it, which reveals their location to Sauron and temporarily subjects Pippin to his influence. And when Pippin screams for help, obviously the other Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli try to help. Each of them struggle with it for a bit before Gandalf finally wakes up and covers the Palantir and tends to Pippin. Now, there is actually somewhat of an advantage to this. He gets a glimpse of Sauron's plans, and he also doesn't snitch about the fact that Frodo has the ring. So, just so you know, since Frodo has not put on the ring for some time, it is implied that Sauron at least has some suspicion that Pippin might have the ring. He's not totally sure. At least that's what the movie conveys. However, I would probably think Sauron's not stupid. He saw Frodo in the first movie. He probably still thinks Frodo has the ring, but he doesn't know where Frodo actually is. He sees a white tree burning, and Gandalf realizes that Sauron plans to attack the great city of Minas Tirith. So Gandalf decides to ride to try and warn them of Sauron's attack, and takes Pippin with him. Probably to make sure that Pippin doesn't get in any more trouble, but Pippin and Merry are separated at this point. And then Arwen is shown a vision. This is not Éowyn. Éowyn, by the way, is the king's daughter. Arwen is his elvish girlfriend. I should have mentioned this, but I did not get the notes correctly. I botched up the notes, but let me get this straight. When I mentioned Éowyn, she is not an elf. She is the king's daughter. Arwen is an elf, and happens to be the closest thing, I guess, to Aragorn's girlfriend, I guess. Arwen is shown a vision of Aragorn while she is with a party traveling to the Grey Haven to travel to the Undying Land. She then goes back to convince Elrond to reforge Narsil into a sword called Anderly. And Narsil, by the way, is the sword that Isildur used to cut off Sauron's finger in the prologue. So it's a pretty important sword. Anyway, we cut back to Gandalf and Pippin arriving at Minas Tirith. The king there's his name is Denethor. And Gandalf mentions that he's merely a steward of Gondor because the line of kings has kind of been disrupted. Which, by the way, the actual heir to Gondor is Aragorn, but he doesn't really want to take up the title. Not yet, at least. And he also tells Pippin to shut up because he doesn't want him knowing that Pippin was somewhat indirectly responsible for Boromir dying, because Boromir is Denethor's son, as well as Faramir as well, but he favors Boromir over Faramir, but he doesn't want him to know that Pippin was indirectly responsible for his death. But Pippin obviously doesn't care. He ignores this. Gandalf recalls how the line of kings failed and lesser men were given rule of Gondor. He also mentions that Sauron is capable of making clouds to ease the way for his orcs to invade. And he does this because I mentioned this, I think, in the first movie. Orcs don't like traveling in the sun, with the exception of the Uruk-hai, who can do that no problem. But I don't think there's any more Uruk-hai being made because in the second movie, Saruman's breeding factory got destroyed. So, I'm sorry. I do not know why I said that, but that is just basically what it is. And Gandalf also reveals that Sauron's most deadly servant is traveling to Minas Tirith to help ensure its destruction. And this is one that no living man can kill. This is the Witch King of Agnar. And also, if you're wondering, the Witch King of Agnar is just the leader of the Nazgul. And in the first movie, this is the same one who stabs Frodo with the Morgul blade. So, yeah. And Gandalf speaks extremely cryptically. I put this in my notes, but then again, that's just like literally Gandalf's entire character, so I don't know why I felt like making a note of that. And Denethor doesn't want to do anything. I don't know why. He just feels like being a lazy asshole. So ultimately, he decides to ask Pippin to light the Beacon of Gondor, and so that Rohan knows of Gondor's needs for aid. I also put, the next sentence I put here requires me to give some context. So in order to try and earn the king's forgiveness, Pippin offered his services to Denethor to try forgive for being somewhat responsible for his favorite son's death. And then Theoden realizes that Gondor needs help. I'm sure he eventually goes and does it. I think he might be initially hesitant, but I'm not sure. I think what happens, and I could be wrong here because it's been 2 months since I've seen the movie, is that he's initially hesitant and then Aragorn has to talk. And then Merry decides to offer his services to Theoden, but Theoden just kind of declines this offer, unlike Denethor, who accepts it. And then it cuts to Faramir, who has lost the city of Osgiliath because the orc forces are A, too great for them, and B, the as if that's not enough, the Nazgul decide to complicate problems with their flying dragons further. And I mentioned that at this point in the movie, I heard the Wilhelm scream again. And I just put, "Are you kidding me?" Because I was kind of fed up with just writing actual notes at this point. Anyway, Gandalf and Pippin ride to aid them so that all of them don't die. Though a lot of them still do because they couldn't get there immediately. Now, Faramir talks to his father, who for whatever reason doesn't seem to understand the true nature of the ring. He appears to be driven mad by a grief and a dark influence, I put it here. And it is I later learned that in the lore, and this is again why I mentioned that the Palantir would be important in this movie, is that there's 7 of them. I mentioned them, I think, all the way back in the first episode, that one of them fell into the hands of Sauron. Well, guess who also Saruman was not the only other one who had a Palantir. Denethor also has one, and Sauron, I think, uses this to essentially break Denethor's will and make it easier to influence him. I guess the idea being that maybe through having him retrieve the ring, he can use the ring's mind-controlling influence to basically get Denethor to bring it back to him. So it's just one of his many ways. The scene switches back to Frodo, who, instead of taking the Black Gate, which is this big, massive gate into Mordor, Gollum suggests they take a shortcut called the Secret Stairs by Downharrow, if I remember correct. I'm not sure if this is the right area, but I could be wrong about the name of the area, but it's another way into Mordor. And Smeagol and Gollum, in essence Gollum, they're basically the same entity, they realize that Sam is a problem and they can't do the plan of killing him while Sam is still there. So they resort to blackmailing Frodo and convincing him that Sam is after the ring, when really Sam is not. In fact, Sam is one of the very few characters in the entire series that's actually pretty much completely immune to the ring's influence. There's a couple of other characters in the books that would be immune to the ring's influence, but we're not going to get it. So Faramir and Pippin meet each other and they're talking, and Faramir reveals that the squire armor that Pippin is currently wearing used to belong to Faramir as a child. And Denethor, for whatever reason, because he's a stubborn asshole in this movie, he decides to ask Faramir to lead a force to go retake Osgiliath, as if that's a good idea. And while he's doing this, he asks Pippin to sing him a song. So Pippin's singing a song, and it's accompanied by what I think is honestly a heartbreaking scene of all the men riding to their dooms under Denethor's command. And oh my goodness. I feel like it's sad because you realize everything just lines up for this scene to be sad for me. Anyway, Aragorn, Legolas, and the other riders of Rohan are on their way to Gondor, but they don't have enough men to help. So while they're taking up camp in Downharrow, Elrond meets up with Aragorn to tell him that Arwen is dying, mostly as a result of Sauron's darkness spreading from Mordor. And he also reveals that in addition to the orcs that are coming to approach them directly, he also sent another force to attack Minas Tirith from the river, which are basically like mercenaries that Sauron hired for his cause. Aragorn basically says, we all have all the manpower we can muster. He says, no, you don't. There's the men under the mountain. And he's like, well, the men under the mountain don't serve anyone. They're loyalists. and they're like, they'll serve the true king of Gondor. And this is where he gives him Anderly, which was forged from the shards of Narsil, which is the sword used to defeat Sauron nearly 3,000 years ago. And I already got into this because I skip around all over the place with random lore. Eowyn, the king's daughter, is here, and she wants to battle, but the king does not really want her to battle. And the way he decides to word it, I think, is really, really indicative of how great of a character he is. He's not so much that he doesn't believe that she's capable of holding herself in her own in battle. More so that he doesn't want her to experience the horrors of battle, and basically says, let us take that burden in your stead so that you can have joy. I'm paraphrasing here, obviously, but I found that to be a really great moment. And it shows you, like, how great this character actually is in the movies at the very least. So Aragorn gathers Legolas and Gimli because obviously he's not going to convince the men under the mountain by himself. And Legolas explains the story of the men under the mountain. So essentially, these are men that promised to help Isildur, Gondor, in its great time of need. But when that great time of need came, they were cowards and retreated under the mountain. So Isildur cursed them so that they would never really truly pass on until they fulfilled their oath to the king of Gondor. Now, Aragorn knows about this and uses this and basically says, hey, if you'll fight for me and help me defend Minas Tirith, then I'll let you free. And they don't agree to this at first, but they do eventually agree to help him take out the river forces so they don't get completely overwhelmed. Now, I put here, this is obviously, like, the battle for Minas Tirith begins, and I put this, like, maybe 20 minutes after this last note, but Denethor is just basically being all, oh, woe is us, we're all doomed, and basically acting like a coward and not really commanding his men to fight properly at all. So Gandalf gets sick of this, and just basically bonks him on the head with the staff to knock him out, and basically takes emergency authority and commands the men of Minas Tirith to stand. And then after the battle started, he commands Pippin to retreat back up to the Citadel, which he does eventually listen to, and this actually comes in important saving a life later. So, at this point, Gollum is leading Frodo through the secret passageway that the secret stairs are going through. But unfortunately, there's a big spider called Shelob that lives in there, and Gollum is essentially planning to let Shelob do the hard work of taking out Frodo for him, and then claiming the ring once he's dead. I put that the light Arendelle that he gets from the end of the first movie is used to help him here, and he knows at least enough Elvish to activate it. Side note, I took the notes for this movie before I took the notes for the first one, which I said that apparently Frodo is pretty fluent in Elvish, so I didn't actually remember the fact that he actually knew Elvish. So, regardless, that's cool. So, he manages to barely escape from Shelob. He collapses in exhaustion and gets a bit of a mental boost from Galadriel. And then it cuts back to Minas Tirith, and it shows us what Denethor is doing. Instead of commanding his men to fight, he's lamenting the loss of Faramir and prepares to burn his body alive. And Pippin notices that the tree has but a singular bloom on it, which I don't really know why I put that there. But more importantly, he discovers that Faramir is not actually dead, and so Denethor, in his stupidity, is going to burn his son alive. He goes back down and lets Gandalf know of this, and obviously Gandalf tries to go and deal with it, but he's stopped by the Witch King of Agnar, who pulls the same shit that he pulled on Saruman and breaks his staff. I think he manages to get his attention diverted elsewhere, and that's how he's able to escape, but I was just like, the heck? Why is the Witch King of Agnar stronger than Gandalf the White? But I guess he wasn't stronger. I guess he just used his powers to target his staff and break it specifically. I don't know. I don't know. Lord of the Rings magic is super strange to me, and I'm going to probably spend like 15 hours researching how the heck it actually works for my new channel. Anyway, sorry about that small interruption there, but Finally, reinforcements from Rohan arrive to help support them, and Pippin actually saves Faramir. And when Denethor realizes that he was gonna burn his son alive, he walks over the place where the fire was and tosses himself off the cliff. So we don't have to deal with Denethor anymore. He's dead. And honestly, that is just out. But honestly, he's a bit of an asshole, but he's also a tragic asshole because his will was essentially broken by Sauron over this course of this thing. The Oliphants, which again are just a bunch of mercenaries hired by Sauron, arrive to reinforce them. And if you don't know what the Oliphants are, just basically imagine war elephants, but they're twice as big and they have spikes literally all over. I said twice as big. I'll correct that to like 5 times as big because holy cow are they large. But Éomer, Theoden's son, does discover that if you target the legs and deal enough damage, you can cause them to collapse over, which does help even things out a bit. And hopefully things are, swinging in the favor of the heroes, and then the Witch King comes to ruin it all. He proceeds to toy around with Theoden, and then Éowyn decides to attack him as well as Pippin, because both of them snuck into and as well as Merry. And this is where, and while facing Éowyn, he triumphantly declares that no man can kill him. And the specifics of this are really weird, so I might explain that in a short or something. But Éowyn proclaims that she is no man because by all technical definitions she's not, she's a woman, and proceeds to one-shot him with an assist from Marioch, which I find cheesy, but also epic and hilarious all at the same time. The definition of proclaiming your victory before it is guaranteed always results in a loss. Anyway, Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli arrive with the armies of the undead, and they basically clean up what's left, because they can attack you, but you can't attack them. So, yeah. Pippin and Merry reunite after the battle, and Aragorn holds the Oath of the Undead to be fulfilled. And now they devise that they figure Frodo needs a little bit more time to destroy the ring and Mountain Doom. So Aragorn decides, in order to give Frodo enough time to destroy the ring, they're going to divert the Eye of Sauron onto them so that Frodo has enough time to destroy it. And he's going to march on the Black Gate to do this. And in a bit of a moment of arrogance, or maybe this is part of his plan to directly switch Sauron's gaze onto him, he grabs the Palantir and he confronts him and is basically like, "You don't scare me." But Sauron decides to show him a vision of Arwen, and that kind of shakes him up a bit. But he still goes and marches onward. Frodo got... Now, an important thing to note, Frodo got captured after passing out from fighting Shelob, but he didn't lose the ring somehow. Sam apparently stuck around. They save him. They perform this whole jailbreak thing I didn't talk about in my notes. But Frodo is growing increasingly tired from the entire ordeal, much like I am at this point in making the notes. Now, when Aragorn's party decides to march on the Black Gate, the Mouth of Sauron, who's a really mysterious character, and you don't see a lot of him, but essentially he acts as like Sauron's messenger, I guess, comes to greet the group. He basically tells them that Frodo died and he suffered greatly. All lies, by the way. And Aragorn decides to respond by cutting off his head, which luckily does the job of attracting Sauron's gaze on him. And I also put here that Sauron calls Aragorn out by name and calls him Elisar as well, which, by the way, I actually looked this up. Elisar means Elfstone in Elvish, and it's another name that Aragorn goes by. Again, why the heck I would look up the translation for a made-up language from a book, a high fantasy book of all things, is beyond me, but I decided to do this. So anyway, while they're battling, Frodo and Sam finally make it to Mount Doom after, like, what, 11 hours worth of footage. They finally make it to Mount Doom, and Sam has to carry Frodo near the end. But Frodo, at this point, I think he's so tired, and he's been holding on to the ring for just a little bit longer than realistically he probably should have. So Frodo doesn't toss the ring in the lava, and instead decides to slip up right at the finish line, and he puts the ring on. And I am just face palming myself, because yes, I obviously saw this coming because I've seen this movie before, but at the same time, dude, you're so close to the finish line. Why would you do that? So obviously, since he put on the ring, Sauron immediately knows where he is, and the Nazgul are making a neck break towards Mount Doom at this point. And Gollum arrives, because Gollum's been chasing after them and is still alive at this point, obviously. And he really wants the precious, the ring. So in order to get it, he actually is pretty clever and figures out by using his footprints where Frodo is. And he ends up biting Frodo's finger off. Oh my goodness. So that Gollum could do it. Who eventually ends up getting pushed into the lava by Sam, I believe. And in the lava that it was made from, the ring finally gets destroyed, collapsing the tower and the Eye of Sauron, and it basically ensures that Sauron can never return as a threat to Middle-earth again. I should mention that in the lore, this does not mean that Sauron is technically dead. His spirit still persists, but he just can't do anything to interrupt Middle-earth at all. Everyone's cheering when the tower collapses, because they know Frodo accomplished his mission. The volcano erupts, and everyone starts to weep, thinking Frodo is lost, and even Gandalf sheds a tear of sadness. And as Sam and Frodo are trying to escape, they bring up happy memories of the Shire as they just kind of stand there ready to accept their fate. But then the Eagles come to save the day and rescue them just in time. And I kid you not, this is an actual thing in the extended edition. There is another 42 minutes of the movie after this point. I didn't really want to take notes at this point, so I was just like, I'm just gonna go over the most important details, which was that Aragorn gets crowned King of Gondor. A lot of the characters join the elves to the Undying Lands, including Frodo. Sam stays behind to write his story, and that's pretty much it. That's all I have in my notes. Oh, wow. This episode ended up being almost as long as the first one, I just realized. Anyway, thank you for watching this episode, and if you're watching the compilation, thank you for watching the super long compilation I put up. I promise you the next episode is not going to be as convoluted as this one. It's going to be a lot more coherent than this. So, anyway, if you enjoyed this episode, you can push the like button and subscribe, all that classic jazz. But also, you can comment what topics you might want me to talk about in the future. I'm currently working on a guest podcast episode, so though I'm not totally sure when it's going to be coming out, but it should be coming out within the next month or two. Anyway, thank you for watching. I'll see you all next week.